I would like to introduce Bob Stuart.
Thank you all for the warm welcome this afternoon. I appreciate being here. I know I've met some of you previously, and you've heard me talk a little bit, so I'll try and change the words around a little bit so you don't get bored. I have talked over the 30 years I've been in law enforcement to all kinds of folks at all kinds of levels. If you need to get up and move around, it's not going to bother me at all. If you want to ask questions in the middle of it, please do. This is not a PowerPoint presentation. It's not a lecture. It's a conversation. And I know we'll probably try and save questions to the end, but if you got something that we need to talk about in the middle of it all, let's go ahead and do that. As Deb mentioned, I am currently the executive officer for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. I work for, obviously, Director Mativi and Attorney General Kobach. They know I'm here, but I am not speaking on behalf of the KBI or either of them. So I've got my KBI badge on, but just as a visual reminder, I'm taking that off and putting it in my pocket because I'm going to talk to you about my previous career. That career was at the FBI. But before I get there, I will address the fact that I went to KU and K-State. I was a K-State undergraduate student and KU law student. So K-State didn't have a law program, so I didn't have a choice but to go to KU. And I'm glad I did. I had a great experience there. After that, I went to work in the district attorney's office in Wyandotte County. Worked for Nick Tomasic for 5 years and got to prosecute during the midst of the cocaine wars and the crack epidemic that was hitting all of us, but hitting Kansas City, Kansas particularly hard. And during that experience, I got to meet some FBI agents working on a multi-state task force. And over dinner and beer one night, they said, well, why don't you apply to be in the FBI? And 27 years later, I retired from the FBI. Not quite sure how that happened. Looking back on it, that God opened the doors in the right spots at the right times for me, and here I am. During the time at the FBI, I spent a lot of time in Dallas, some time in DC, some time, unfortunately, I spent a summer in Alaska. Terrible time up there. That work a little bit better back there? Okay. I'll move that out of the way so we don't get crossed. A summer in Alaska and a winter in Barbados with the FBI. So working at the United States Embassy. So I've somehow gotten relatively lucky through my career to end up in the right places at the right times. I have been over in some of the war-torn parts of the world at different times on behalf of the FBI and on your behalf as well. I spent the last 10 years in Kansas City as the Chief Division Counsel. There are 56 FBI field divisions, and I was one of 56 general counsels or lawyers for the FBI in the field. So in that role, you of course sit at the right hand of the boss of the office, a special agent in charge, and you see everything. So there wasn't anything going on in the Kansas City division of the FBI office for the last 12 years that I did not know of or was not involved with in some way or shape or form. So with that background, and then I retired after 27 years. You have to retire from the FBI at 57 years old. So when I turned 57, I retired. I was retired for exactly a month, and two things happened. My wife said, "Get out." And Tony Mativi called and said, "Hey, I'm the new director at the KBI. You and I have worked together for a number of years. I'd like you to come on board and help me take the KBI into the next 10 or 15 years as we move forward and think about what we want to do with the KBI." So that's my general backstory. It's not what I'm here to talk about, though. What I wanted to talk with you about, and I know what you all are very interested in, that is, and I'm calling it the politicization of justice. And I will start at kind of the highest level about what I've observed over the years, just generally speaking. And then I will talk about what I see inside the Department of Justice. And then I will talk about what I saw in the last several years I was at the FBI And there's politicization at all three of those levels. And it kind of has come kind of coincidentally as my career has progressed, but it's also come kind of at an accelerated pace. And hopefully I can explain that. At the biggest level, justice, I am worried, is losing its blindfold. We all talk and think about Lady Justice being blind and treating everybody that comes before her with equal thought, with applying the law appropriately and equally across the board. I would suggest to you that even when I was in law school in 1990 and 91, that was already starting to become a problem. And what I mean is this. We all already know and are starting to get better sense today than we did then that our universities are liberal bastions. That was the case in law school at the University of Kansas in 1990 and 91. My constitutional law professor was a man who, and this is stereotypical, right, but it was true with him, wore wool socks and Birkenstocks. Now, that's just a funny stereotype, but his lecture style, the way he taught constitutional law, was from a very liberal perspective. That affects young minds, right? Professors have enormous authority over children, or over kids, over law school students. Teachers have it over kids, right? So here in law school, even in the 1990s, in the middle of Kansas, there was already a liberal bent. I was a relatively conservative college kid, probably gotten more conservative over my years, but not terribly much more than I was then. And I was in a minority even in 1990 and 91. So what is the effect of that observation? I think that at some levels of the legal profession, not all, at some levels of the legal profession, there is an overrepresentation of one side of the political spectrum, not the side that's in the room. And generally speaking, most of those folks that had a different more liberal position than you or I would have, still operated under the framework of the law as we like to think of it then and like to think of it now. That Lady Justice was blind, that we could have differing opinions, that they might think differently than me. I had lots of arguments in law school because I knew I wanted to get into prosecution and law enforcement with people who thought that, at a very fundamental level, wanted to think the idea that we should mollycoddle criminals, that crime wasn't as bad as we thought, that all the things that we think of as a liberal perspective about crime, they held. And we argued in law school. But they didn't dismiss my views. They didn't think that the Constitution somehow unequally applied, or they didn't take their positions about those things in such a way as to completely dismiss the right side of the table. But something's happened since that time. And part of it is those people I graduated from law school became leaders. I went, two of probably the most liberal folks I went to law school with ended up working at the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division 30 years ago. If they started that liberal and are now surrounded by more liberal behavior, more liberal attitudes toward the law, and they then, the next generation of lawyers came in and they taught them, and the next generation taught them, that sliding scale, I think, is one of the big picture reasons why we're at a point in thinking about what you hear some people call lawfare, the politicization of justice, where a lot of that has happened. I think it's accelerated a great deal in the last 5 years, 7 years maybe, because of a guy named Donald J. Trump. I think the idea that is now acceptable is the ends justify the means. So those maybe 20 years where the Department of Justice slowly became more liberal, slowly became more thinking about wanting to prosecute the crimes that they thought attacked their enemies, accelerated because the gloves came off because of Donald J. Trump. They thought he was the devil. They think he is the devil. So anything goes, right? That's how it seems to work. And so that accelerated process of liberalization and using the law against regular citizens in America is becoming more and more acceptable. So that's the kind of the big picture piece that I see from the law in general. Now, inside the Department of Justice specifically, it did start in the Civil Rights Division. The Civil Rights Division, when I started at the FBI, worried mainly about what they call color of law cases, which were cases where law enforcement officers violated people's constitutional rights, either by way of excessive use of force. Am I getting some hum there? Either by excessive use of force or any number of ways where they were completely just violating law, stealing from people and search warrants and things like that. That's what the Civil Rights Division started off doing. Previously, in the 60s, they of course had of civil rights. That's why the Civil Rights Division stood up, was because of issues in the South, right, regarding discrimination. But it bended by the time I was there in the 90s to the point where they were dealing more with law enforcement issues. At about the time I started, it became only a division worried about the abortion issue, FACE Act violations. We tried at the FBI in Dallas to put a number of cases involving bad cops in the Dallas area in front of the Civil Rights Division for prosecution, and they didn't go anywhere because their attorneys were focused on FACE Act violation cases pretty much solely. That has not gotten better. That has only gotten worse. As you can see, I know you've all heard the stories and seen the media representations of FACE Act cases that have just gone off the edge in terms of people who have peaceably demonstrated in ways that should not have been considered a FACE Act violation that somehow got prosecuted as FACE Act violations. FACE Act, I assume most people understand what that is, the prohibition against being too close to abortion providers and providing a pro-life position about abortions anywhere near the front or the access points to an abortion clinic. That's all they prosecuted. That has spread insidiously throughout the Department of Justice to the point that now what we are seeing is, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, things like the Catholic memo. If you haven't heard about it, I'll talk about it a little bit. Things like focusing the intelligence products toward political movements. This is not new particularly. Things like that have happened in the history of the Department of Justice and the FBI for years. In the 70s, there was something called the CISPAS cases. The FBI opened, for lack of a better way of putting it, domestic terrorism cases against nuns in El Salvador because they were worried about the Contra affair and about arms moving into El Salvador in the 70s and 80s. Clearly not paying attention to the Constitution and the strictures of the United States Supreme Court on law enforcement activities while they were doing it. So this is history repeating itself in a number of ways, some of the things we're going to talk about. But at the time, at least, Congress had the wherewithal to pull the FBI and the Department of Justice before committees, the Church Committee amongst others, and pulled them back to task. Said, that you can't do that, that's wrong, here's what you need to do to fix it. I don't know that I see that happening. Maybe it'll happen in the future with the way the FBI and the Department of Justice have kind of gone off course a little bit to correct it, to correct the process. So the department has been more and more isolated and liberalized, partly because of that internal push, partly because more and more lawyers come from a liberal perspective, because law schools teach that, they recruit that. It's harder to find conservative law school students. It's hard to find conservative college students. It's just how things are going these days. And so that process, I think, is part of the underlying piece. It's a complicated puzzle. It's not a one puzzle. But with those observations in mind, I really want to talk about the FBI. That's where I do have some expertise and can talk a little bit more in detail. I kind of live in the nuance of it, so you'll have to forgive me a little bit. I am neither an apologist for the FBI, that they're the greatest law enforcement organization on the planet and they don't do anything wrong, nor am I a let's blow up the FBI and start all over. I'm kind of in the middle about it. There's some things that are wrong and need to be fixed. So I'm kind of sitting in the middle to some degree about what the pathway forward is. But there's some things I think are pretty obvious. And one of the things I've always argued is, y'all remember the old television show Law and Order? At the beginning of the Law and Order show, when they're doing the running the credits through for the screen, they say something like, these are the police, they investigate the crimes. These are the prosecutors, they prosecute the crimes. And that's how it should be. And in my experience, that's how it works best, having both been an agent putting handcuffs on people and a prosecutor prosecuting them in court. Those aren't the same job. And investigators should investigate and prosecutors should prosecute. And when those mix up, it's never a good thing. And at the very highest level, the last 3 directors of the FBI have been prosecutors. Not only that, they've been the very highest level of prosecutors. Robert Mueller, Chris Wray, and Mr. Comey, James Comey, all were executives at the Department of Justice. They were deputy attorney generals. Those jobs are, by their definitions, political jobs. That's all they do, is think about the politics of it. They're the ones that, their boss, their direct boss, is a cabinet level minister for the president. So they can't do anything but think about politics. Generally speaking, and this has been that way for a very long time in the Department of Justice, it takes the lower level folks that are the actual prosecutors that have gone into court, been in front of juries, have said, Judge, here's what we want to do, have looked at a jury and said, please find this person guilty. Those level of prosecutors are where the real work is done. They're several layers down. But these guys, the last 3 directors of the FBI, and now Mr. Wray, a 4th, all came as directly from the Department of Justice. What does that happen? What's caused? What is the effect? The effect is the FBI is no longer as independent as it used to be or as it needs to be. The most obvious explanation of that is, and I know you all remember it, is when when Jim Comey said, hey, we're going to take the brunt of deciding not to prosecute, not to go after Hillary Clinton. That's not the FBI's decision. The FBI finds the facts and hands it over to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor has to decide those things. And that he decided, on behalf of the FBI, just to make that determination, he, by definition, politicized the FBI. Now, it was already starting a little bit. There were already signs of that. There were already too many situations that I'm aware of where the FBI just did what the Department of Justice attorneys told us to do. Now, here's where the nuance is. The FBI is an element of the Department of Justice. It's just like the KBI director works for the Attorney General, the FBI director works for the Attorney General. So there has to be some level of accountability and some level of oversight. But there has to be a tension. It's only appropriate when there's some level of tension between the investigators and the prosecutors. We should be taking cases as an investigator to the prosecutor, and they should say, yep, you've got enough. I think I can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm going to charge. Or, nope, Bob, you don't have enough. You're not proving one of the elements of the crime. Go back and try again. Or, you're nowhere near this. Stop messing with this and go do something else. I mean, that tension is, that's when we as the public are best served, is when our prosecutors and our investigators have that level of tension. Because that way we get to justice most effectively and most efficiently and most correctly. But when the FBI starts to be nothing but yes men for the politicized Department of Justice, then we have real problems. The tension doesn't exist anymore. And what happens is what we're starting to see now, which is investigative activities being undertaken by the FBI with their extraordinary power that are politically motivated by the Department of Justice, who are politically motivated by the White House. And the example I will give you is one that I got sideways with my FBI friends as I was leaving the organization. That's what's called the Catholic Memo. Some people heard of that, some people haven't? All right, for those of you who haven't, I'll kind of give you a little bit of backstory. And then I'll sort of fill back in about how this is also important in another way. The FBI is not only a criminal investigative agency, it also is an intelligence agency. Post 9/11, we'll talk about that if I have time. As part of that, we have a large cadre of investigative analysts who both direct FBI agents to do work, but also try and figure out legitimately sometimes what the gap is. Like, what are bank robbers doing these days? How do we catch them? How do we predict them? Is an easy example. But they're constantly doing that work. And in the Richmond division of the FBI, which is a small division of the FBI, probably in the bottom 20% of sizes of FBI offices, an intelligence analyst that works in the domestic terrorism realm decided she was going to write a product and got the support of her fellow subject matter experts of the area, saying that in essence, certain elements of the Catholic Church, particularly those that weren't meeting in a parish house, or meeting in a basement maybe, who preferred traditional Latin Mass, who were adamantly opposed to abortion, might be harboring, housing, recruiting, or dealing with domestic terrorists or people that would cause this country harm. And therefore, based upon a series of conclusions she made, she suggested that it would be appropriate for FBI agents to develop sources to identify these house churches, these small groups of maybe more conservative Catholics who were meeting together, to identify them, to reach out to them and trying to develop some of them as sources. I was in my 26th year of the FBI when I saw that product. The way products work is they go into a portal and anybody can access it by search terms inside the FBI and inside other agencies that have access to FBI databases. So somebody mentioned it to me that it was out there, one of our intelligence analysts in the Kansas City office, and I said, "You got to be kidding me, right?" And so I accessed it and took a look at it, and I can't think of a time in all the years I've done this where I so immediately and viscerally thought, this is a constitutional violation on its face, without any comment. Anybody that's ever thought about First Amendment protections and freedoms is going to look at this and say, "You got to be kidding me." And because the sole reason to target FBI agents at identifying these folks as sources was because of their what? Their First Amendment rights, their right to choose their religion, their right to meet together, their right to talk about it, their right to complain about the government when it comes to abortion. All those things were all right there. All four of the major pieces of the First Amendment, outside of the right to freedom of the press, was all right there. And yet they didn't have any other articulation for why. The way it normally works is, I would have advised folks that, yes, we can look at somebody that would fit one of those categories, but only if we have something else. Only if we have indicia at some reasonable level that they're committing a federal crime. Or if they're committing a state crime, we would pass it to our state partners like the folks at the KBI. There was none of that. There was just the bald allegation that, in her view, people that may go to these church meetings or these group meetings, they might be dangerous. That's it. That's bad enough as it is, but intelligence products have to go through a check series before they get put into that portal that I talked about. A supervisory analyst has to review it. So somebody with 10 years of FBI experience, at least in a supervisory role, has to approve that. My counterpart, the Chief Division Counsel in Richmond, had to approve it before it got uploaded into this portal that everybody could access. No one disapproved this product. No one sent it back for a review. No one said, "Hey, what are you doing? We can't even think about this." It got approved through the Richmond office, and it was in the portal, which means that FBI headquarters also saw it and didn't. I had experience more than once where FBI headquarters disagrees with the field and picks up the phone and calls you and tells you, "Stop that." No one at FBI headquarters picked up the phone and called Richmond Division and said, "Stop that." It went out. I started fussing about it and immediately got pushback. About the time I was trying to figure out what to do personally about it, it got released to the public. Somebody either whistleblew or inappropriately whistleblew, one of the two, and it got out to the public. And Congress got a hold of it pretty quickly and called Director Wray to the carpet in front of a hearing. And Director Wray didn't disavow it. He acknowledged it happened, said it was a mistake, said it had been withdrawn. So that's the Catholic memo. And that's the example of what I see as the bigger problem. A lot of that is based, and I will go back to 9/11. One of the consequences of 9/11 was Director Mueller at the time was very worried that Congress was, because the FBI knew some things and didn't do anything about it. Didn't have the full picture, but knew some things prior to 9/11. Didn't do anything about it. There was a push to dissolve the FBI into a criminal organization and a separate national security organization, which is much like what Britain does with MI5 and MI6 and Scotland Yard. The FBI, generally speaking, and I at the time thought that's a bad idea. We lose too much view into the work that we do in criminal investigations if we don't have the intelligence branch sharing that data, and there are protections by which those stay separate. And that's most evident in espionage cases, in Russian espionage cases and Chinese espionage cases. Having that both pieces of that puzzle, the intelligence folks and the criminal investigative folks working together, is the best way to handle foreign national espionage matters. Still is the case today. But during the process of articulating to Congress on what Director Mueller did was he articulated to Congress, we need to stay together and we need to empower the intelligence analyst cadre. Agents always ran the FBI. Don't anymore. As an aside, when I started at the FBI in 1996, there were 10 lawyers in FBI headquarters, and 8 of them were badge, gun, special agent of the FBI attorneys. 2 of them were specialists in civil litigation and car wrecks, and they weren't agents. Now the FBI has more than 100 lawyers. 1 of them is an FBI agent. All the rest are civilians. So it's not a law enforcement run organization anymore. Lots of big reasons for that, lots of small reasons for that. But inside of the point I want to make is, Director Mueller made a big deal of we need to empower and build up the intelligence cadre of the FBI and professionalize it much like there is at the CIA. CIA does things by what they call desks. So they'll have a Russian desk, and inside that desk, they'll have senior analytical personnel and new analytical personnel that studied Russian history in college and could speak the language and were experts in that area. And that's where they stayed their whole career. They didn't bounce over and suddenly work Iran matters or other places in the world, because that wasn't their area of expertise. So the FBI tried to mimic that. And it's worked a little bit and failed a little bit. One of the things that's happened, though, is, and this is going to be a little bit sexist, but it is the way it is, agents still tend to be law enforcement, military, short-haired guys. Our analytical cadre, we've learned over the years, is college-educated young women who, much like I was articulating before about law school, we tend to get a more liberal, the FBI tended to get a more liberal set of folks working inside the FBI in the intelligence arm of the FBI. Not necessarily a bad thing. Some of them are, the vast majority of them are phenomenal at their jobs. I have read more than one product that came from young intelligence analysts who I would probably not have much in common with at all, who wrote very good products that made a difference to our safety in this country. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I do want to say that as a general stereotypical position, that's what's happened. And I would suggest that this young lady in Richmond has bought into those liberal ideas. And what hasn't happened, though, is there hasn't been the guidance and the top that level down capability to say, no, you have to leave the blindfold on. Your personal politics don't matter when you walk in the door of the FBI office. They don't matter when you walk in the door of the Attorney General's office. They don't matter when you walk in the door of the courthouse. They don't matter when you walk in the door of the KBI. We're protecting everybody. And that attitude has gone away. And I think a great deal of it has happened very quickly because of the hatred of Donald Trump. I don't know how else to say it because the gloves are off to them. They walk in. I probably went 20 years in the FBI without talking politics ever to anybody for any reason. There wasn't any, I wouldn't have known what your politics were. And you wouldn't have known mine. And that's how it was supposed to work. And all of a sudden, that's there a lot. All of a sudden, you hear about stories in FBI offices where somebody brought in, some bumper sticker and put it up in their cube, and somebody else was politically opposed to that, so ripped it down. And it went both ways. But the politics of it now are inside the FBI office. And quite frankly, I could tell you kind of proudly that I haven't seen that at the KBI yet at all. And I would probably stomp up and down as the executive officer if I saw it. But I did see it at the FBI. I did see times where in every FBI office, there is a picture of the Attorney General, a framed picture of the Attorney General, and a framed picture of the President, and a framed picture of the Director of the FBI. If you walk into an FBI office, and you'll see it right over here at the Landmark Center, wherever the office is here in Wichita, and those are there. And all of a sudden, in FBI offices, the Trump picture kept getting taken down and put away. So that's what was happening. And there was no top-down stop of that. There should have been immediate examples made. There should have been an immediate, kind of like when the Air Force has a plane that crashes, they do a ground stop. Everybody stops, they go retrain, they figure out what the problem was, they deal with the safety issue. Same thing should have happened at the FBI. We're doing a stop day. We're not doing anything else except re-emphasizing ethics, re-emphasizing the blindness of justice, re-emphasizing that politics don't belong inside the FBI and that there won't be tolerance for it. It didn't happen because I think partly the very top level of FBI bosses were so tied into the politics and so tied into the Department of Justice that there was no, they were blind to it themselves. And of course, I've seen good men and women go back to, that I worked with, that I would go indoors with, that I trusted my life with, go back to FBI headquarters, and there's a phrase, it's called drinking the Kool-Aid. They'd go back and drink the Kool-Aid, and all of a sudden, the power inside of Washington, D.C., the money inside of Washington, D.C., the constant emphasis inside Washington, D.C., would get them to where they started thinking politically. And then, quite frankly, realizing that there's only one thing you could say out loud there, and that's, I don't like Donald J. Trump. I told the story, and for those of you that were in the other, in my other talk, you'll have to hear it again. A guy I worked with for years, one of the civilian lawyers I talked about, he is probably one of the 5 or 10 government lawyers that best understands government employment law issues. So, and as for those of you who have employees know, dealing with employee issues in your workplaces takes more of your day than you wished it took. Same way at the FBI. And so some of my days as the Chief Division Counsel were dealing with personnel issues. And the simple ones I understood and could deal with, but the complicated ones I often had to call him up. And he would guide me through the process. He was the guy. You pick up the phone, he'd always answer, he'd always help you out. And he was my friend. And when I was back in D.C., we'd hang out and go have fish somewhere, because getting fish in Kansas is hard. So I'd always get fish when I was back with him in D.C. Don't know why I told you that, but I did. But we'd go out, and 5 years ago, I went back there, and his personality changed. He was different. And I talked to another friend, and I said, "What's wrong with him?" And he said, "This Trump thing scares him." I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "He's scared that the country's gonna dissolve if Trump gets made president." One of the smartest employment law lawyers I've ever met, that I trusted and that I worked with weekly for years, had that Trump derangement syndrome. I'd never heard the term until about that same time as him. I'm like, I know a guy that's happening to. It got so bad that he had a nightmare. Apparently, as the story goes, he had a nightmare one night. Got up to get a drink of water, tripped and broke his ankle, and blamed Donald Trump. How does a reasonable man get to that point? Surrounded by everything he was surrounded by. It got to the point that he would openly talk about his hatred of Donald Trump in the FBI office, in the main office hallway, because he was one of the main lawyers in the main office hallway. And folks I knew that disagreed with his position worked for him. What position are they in? And that kind of gets me to my ultimate question as we're kind of getting close to a place where I can answer questions. And that is, and I'm guilty of this too. I mean, and you can call it lots of different things, but could I have said more? Could I have done more? I mean, I was right at the end of my career. Do I want to be a loudmouth about it at the end of my career? Do I want to not? Do I want to just get out the door here? What about people that aren't at their point of retirement? To retire in the FBI, you have to have 20 years of service and be 50 years old. And you have to retire by 57. So what if you're your 18th year? You don't know what you want to do, but you really see something going on in your field office or in your investigative, or you're a guy sitting in the Richmond office and you see this report, the Catholic memo. What do? That's where we're stuck, because there are a lot of great people at the FBI, and that's why I can't really articulate that I want to blow the whole place up and start over. But how do we empower them? How do we get them to say and do the right thing all the time? You would have expected that FBI agents who are willing to risk their lives would be willing to risk their career as well. But they don't. And I don't know if that's part of just Western society, that money is the almighty thing. And that being comfortable and secure in your retirement is more important than, well, maybe I'm just not going to say anything about that memo. I saw it, and I'm not going to say anything about it. I don't know how we get the FBI, the Department of Justice lawyers, and they're a great Department of Justice lawyers. They're phenomenal prosecutors that do amazing work there, that protect us as we speak. They're working to protect us. And I don't want to throw them out either. But how do we empower them? How do we as citizens empower them to feel comfortable speaking up and saying enough? I'm done with the politics of this. We need to put Lady Justice's blindfold back squarely on her eyes instead of slipping down over her nose and peeking over the top. So that's kind of where I'm at and what I've seen. If y'all have questions, comments, if you want to take the conversation in different directions. Yeah, yes, sir. I think they were going to hand another mic, give them that microphone, and I'll just talk louder into this one.
You just talk right into that.
Okay.
Answer, if you're kind of close to it.
All right.
If you have any questions, the Pachyderm members will try to get to you first, so we're going to start right here.
Yes, sir. One thing I've heard is to get the FBI out of the swamp in D.C. and move the headquarters to Huntsville, Alabama. Would that be good to get the politics out of the FBI by moving the headquarters to Huntsville, Alabama?
I agree with that 100%. I think, as I said, that going back into that swamp back there, going back to D.C. with the power and the money that's there, people drink the Kool-Aid back there. And if that were either decentralized, I mean, in today's day and age, you don't have to be in D.C. to do D.C. work. You can live in Lawrence, Kansas. You can live in Peabody, Kansas. And with the internet connection and Zoom and all the sort of stuff that we can do, you don't have to be working there. So either decentralize and make FBI headquarters have very few employees there, or move it to Huntsville.
And this was in late, in February, right after the president got elected. Homeland Security did something when they made anyone who disagreed. If you haven't seen this, it's on their site. But I wondered how you would speak into when they said anyone who disagrees with the presidential office and stuff, it's now a homeland terrorist.
I am not as familiar with Homeland Security as I am with the FBI, obviously. And quite frankly, there are some internecine wars that's, Homeland Security is a new element since 9/11. And the FBI is jealous, big picture FBI is jealous of its authority, its power, and its budget. And that DHS took some of that authority, power, and budget, meant that there were some fights and not a lot of communication between those two agencies. But with that said, inside the intelligence parts of both DHS and the FBI, there is a level of cooperation. And they are doing exactly what you talked about, which is using stereotypical terms to put them together in piles of 3 or 4, and then say, make just the bald conclusion that Catholic, conservative, doesn't like abortion, doesn't go to the normal parish, that somehow equals, we need their suspicion and we should look at them. Same sort of thing. What other factors are there? Christian, male, heterosexual. I mean, you start piling those things into piles, and you can use any 4 or 5 of you want to, and someone will conclude that is a danger. And then they will use the power of the FBI or the power of DHS to start looking more closely, either by way of surveillance, by way of electronic surveillance, by way of any more contacting social media companies and dredging data from them, which is terribly problematic in my view. So yes, all those pieces exist and are something we should be fighting back against every day.
In 1965, my family, young kids, were in Washington, D.C., and we got a tour of the FBI. And at that time, they said only CPAs and attorneys can apply for FBI agents. Was that true? Is that still true today?
It was mostly true in 1965. There were some other pieces. Over the years, that's changed. Right now, the standard to get into the FBI is you have to have a college degree and 3 years of experience in a relevant field. By way of the number of applicants in the FBI, though, nearly everybody has a master's level degree, and at times the FBI picks different people. When I came into the FBI, they were looking for attorneys because it was in the middle of the savings and loan crisis. and they were looking for CPAs and attorneys that could deal with a lot of the white-collar problems about the savings and loan crisis. I got assigned to Dallas because Dallas had a lot of the savings and loan issues. When I got to Dallas, though, I was assigned to work healthcare fraud. So, you know, things don't always work like they're supposed to. There have been different times where we've hired more military because, there was a glut of military folks that were well qualified for the job, and we had some tactical level positions on our SWAT teams and things like that where their experience was highly valuable. So the FBI has adjusted. It's not concrete in how they've done it, but in 65 and 66, the vast majority were CPAs and lawyers and probably military then. Maybe some police officers. We've always hired a certain number of detective level police officers that wanted to advance their careers by coming to the FBI as well.
Separation of powers doctrine has always been a part of our system. You mentioned that the investigators and prosecutors both work on the same part of justice. And have you giving suggestions on how they can be separated out so each of them can be independent and serve checks and balances on each other? That's the first question. Second question, you ever thought about writing a book on what you're talking about today?
I would say that there's no other place to put both law enforcement and prosecutors other than under the executive branch. So under the three parts of government, it sort of has to be there. That said, I talked about the tension. At the FBI, the solution is you don't hire anybody at the highest levels of the FBI that comes from main justice. You hire a New York City police commissioner or the Oklahoma City police chief, or somebody that isn't part of that inner network of folks at the highest level in DC to come in and run the FBI, and you empower that leader, whoever he or she is, to say, no, we're going to exert our independence here.
Book.
How about a book?
Writing a book. How about writing a book?
Me? I don't know that I'd have more than one chapter.
I wanted to ask you about how do we go about protecting the whistleblowers? Because to me, that's a huge problem. When they were investigating Hunter Biden, they spoke up now. And then there's others that are being squashed financially, just crushed. And there's supposed to be protection for whistleblowers, but that doesn't seem to be happening in the FBI. So what do we do to protect them?
There's a young man, an FBI agent, who properly blew the whistle on part of you remember people going to school boards to complain, that the FBI started looking at some of that. I didn't address that issue, don't have enough time, but that's a similar one to the Catholic memo. He legitimately followed the procedure to be a whistleblower. He was in the midst of transferring from the Kansas City office to another office and was told when he showed up at the other office he's suspended without pay. He's not allowed to get another job, but they haven't fired him, and it's been 18 months or longer. He's a legitimate whistleblower by everyone's admission, and yet the FBI is doing nothing about it. To your point, what do we do about it? We call up our representatives and fuss. Squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? I mean, our folks are doing what they can, but they need to be reminded, as hard as we can remind them, and as politely as we can remind them, while pushing that a little bit, that, hey, this only works. Whistleblower statutes only work if we protect the people that actually do that. And we're not protecting that guy because he's financially at straits right now. They tried to raise money for him, and the FBI told him, you're ethically barred from taking that fundraising money to support your family. So he's trying to, other guys have just said, the heck with it, I'm just quitting, and given the FBI the finger, so to speak, and maybe actually to speak. But he hasn't. He's decided to continue to try and fight the fight. And he has he's been in front of the weaponization committee, and to some level, politicians, they're there in front of the microphone, they're there in front of the committee hearing, but they're so busy, even if they have the best of intentions, sometimes that gets dropped off their radar. It stays on their radar by the thing that you and I can do is keep bugging them about it. Hey.
You know, this is a good topic. We have lots of questions, so we got some more.
My question ties in a little bit with the one previously back there. If you had the ear of the next president, who are some names that you could recommend to help clean up the FBI?
Oh, I haven't thought about that. You know, I don't have anybody in particular that doesn't sound like I'm not doing nothing but, hey boss, Tony Mativi would be a great example of that. Although he doesn't meet all the qualifications. He spent time at Maine Justice. He was not high up in the levels there, but he was a Department of Justice lawyer for a number of years, which sort of, I just said I wouldn't want a Department of Justice lawyer being the boss, but somebody like Director Mativi would be very good at it. There's the guy that was, and I can't think of his name right now, he just retired as the chief of police in Kansas City, Missouri a year ago or so ago. He'd be a great example. Experienced law enforcement, experienced sophisticated law enforcement. So part of my qualification would be you'd have to come from a department that didn't just respond to, and it sounds bad, didn't just respond to the regular crime on the street, that had sophisticated cases, detectives working white collar cases and gang cases and organized crime cases, because if you didn't have that sort of experience under your belt, it would be hard to lead the FBI. And big departments have to have that. I mean, so it would be a big major city department chief that had experience dealing with a big community that was racially diverse, ethnically diverse, socially diverse, economically diverse, because that's the country, right? And the FBI has got to represent all of those folks. So you'd want a director that had the experience of working with a community where one week he had, some immigrants from Laos coming in and saying, here's our problem. And the next minute having some folks from the Baptist church come in and say, here's our problem, that he or she was able to deal with. That would be, to me, the optimal leader. Other than the guy whose name I can't remember in Kansas City, Missouri, that's the kind of guy I'd be looking for.
When I was 12 years old, it came to my attention that Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General for his brother. And that seemed to me like really odd, just watching the house. And I started thinking about the idea that maybe the Attorney General of the United States should be an elected position and not a appointed position by the guy that he's going to be watching over. And I think maybe we should have a movement to that effect, that the Attorney General of the United States, like the Attorney General of Kansas, is an elected position, the watchdog to be focusing maybe on an officer election instead of.
I like it. I've heard other people talk about it. Of course, that requires a constitutional change to do so at the federal level. But clear to the other side.
You had mentioned that we're kind of in the middle on what should happen with the FBI. Can you give us 2 or 3 examples of what you may suggest of reestablishing the FBI? Second part of my question, in your opinion, how much was the FBI and the DOJ involved in the January 6th?
Okay. The first one's relatively easy because you all have astutely gotten most of the way there and listened to what I was talking about. The first is a director that doesn't come from the Department of Justice. The second is potentially moving FBI headquarters out of Washington, D.C., or minimizing it and regionalizing it more than it is. Then the third piece, I think, would be those stand-down days I was talking about, where the FBI, regular ethics training is required, but bringing in some outside constitutional experts to remind everybody that your politics stays at the door. When you come in the office of the FBI, if you start using your biases, your political biases, whatever they are, you're wrong, and that's got to stop. So I think those 3 pieces would be the 3 things I would do probably most urgently.
But do you really think that the relocation of the FBI to another, wherever it is, would really solve a situation? Because it's a mindset within those people that kind of spreads, against the other.
None of those is either a guarantee or an end-all be-all. I think those are just parts that I think can. I've often heard, and I often even use, the FBI is a battleship. You can't turn it around in a bathtub. It's a 9 million point turn if you tried to do it. So what I'd be suggesting to do is let's get the battleship moving, veer it back toward the straight and normal course instead of the left course.
And then that second.
To the second piece, I've got to be careful here because I still am under some strictures from the FBI because I was the Chief Division Counsel when that was going on. I will tell you, generally speaking, I'm a little skeptical that there was a lot of FBI involvement there. Some folks in the Kansas City office had some sources that were around and available and were giving us data. And I think what happened that day surprised the majority of folks I know. Now, that's from my limited Kansas City perspective, not from what one of the other 55 field divisions of the FBI office was doing or what FBI headquarters was doing. My critique, quite frankly, is far more what's happened since then in terms of the reaction of the FBI and the Department of Justice to that, rather than whether that was instigation. Bob's personal position is that the situation sort of happened and certain people took advantage of it and were sort of led to, here's a can of gas, go. I mean, not really a can of gas, but they egged it on, they pushed it on in the right places with the right people. But was there intentionality beforehand from even the far left position? I don't see anything inside the FBI that would show that to me.
In simple terms, since the majority of the agency is going to be civil servants, with a new president, how deep could he go in actually changing the after administration?
It would require a great deal of a president's political capital. Because just as I said, the FBI is a battleship. It's even a battleship when it comes to who's in the president's office. I mean, my years at the FBI, I had Clinton as a president. Bush as president. So I didn't perceive a whole lot of movement one way or the other. There were some slight things. Congress could do it too. They could, for example, when I became an agent and started doing healthcare fraud, that was because Senator Castlebaum here in Kansas and Senator Kennedy got together and passed the Kennedy-Castlebaum legislation, which was designed to deal with healthcare fraud stuff. Put a whole bunch of money into it, and so the FBI used that money, hired me and other people to work healthcare fraud cases. So the battleship of the FBI moved a little bit this way to work healthcare fraud cases because of the money and agents we were given to do so. So at some level, not only can Congress do that with the power of the purse, the president can do that with who he puts in the top spot. He or she gets to put in the director, and he can look at the director and say, director of the FBI, you're going to have 5 assistant directors that think this way or do this. Now, you say that, and what are we doing though? Politics. How much do we want the executive or the White House, no matter who's there, telling the FBI who they should hire and how they should make decisions? So you worry about the battleship.
So what is FBI doing to prevent China from taking over cybersecurity?
This is one thing that I agree with what the FBI is, and there are a lot of things I agree with the FBI on. And one of the things is their work in terms of Chinese espionage matters. It is, I was back probably 10 years ago now at a conference at the CIA headquarters in Langley. And they had a guy talk to us who was a Russian spy who came to America and now helps us mostly, although I'm skeptical sometimes of what he does. But he described it this way, and I wish I could do a Russian accent because it's way better if I could, but I can't. But he told us, all there were 10 or 15 of us in the room, he told us, he said, the Russian way of doing things, we always wanted to make a big splash. So we would recruit somebody like Robert Hansen, who was an FBI supervisor, who had access to lots of information, and they sucked all that information out of that one guy. So that's the Russian sort of paradigm, the Russian way of spying on America. He said, but China's different. He said, China will look at a beach in America and say, we want that beach. And they'll steal it 1 grain of sand at a time. They will send so many people over and so many resources, and they'll tell them, pick up a grain of sand. And pretty soon America will turn over and go, didn't there used to be a beach there? And it'll be in China's pocket. And I thought that was a really astute way of explaining how China did that. And so we're really fighting, trying to figure out how do we attack all those different pieces, all those different attack fronts.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah, according to Fox, using government statistics, 45,000 Chinese males military age have come into the border the last 2 years. Do you know if they've linked up with the Islamic training centers here? And would the Islamic nature be a refrain for the FBI to investigate?
I am aware of no connection between those two. China does its own thing. I will say, to circle back to your comment when we started about marijuana, that we see from our friends in Oklahoma that the Chinese triad, so the Chinese organized crime groups, are basically running illegal marijuana operations in Oklahoma under the guise of legal medical marijuana in Oklahoma. So our Chinese adversary is committing crime at extraordinary levels in Oklahoma because of the medical marijuana legalization down there.